Welcome aboard, fellow enthusiasts, as we embark on another incredible video. Thank you for joining us today as we dive into Intelligentsia. The Intelligentsia is a status class composed of the university-educated people of a society who engage in the complex mental labors by which they critique, shape, and lead in the politics, policies, and culture of their society. As such, the Intelligentsia consists of scholars, academics, teachers, journalists, and literary writers. Conceptually, the Intelligentsia status class arose in the late 18th century, during the Partitions of Poland. Etymologically, the 19th Polish intellectual Bronisław Trentowski coined the term Intelligentsia intellectuals to identify and describe the university-educated and professionally active social stratum of the patriotic bourgeoisie, men and women whose intellectualism would provide moral and political leadership to Poland in opposing the cultural hegemony of the Russian Empire. Before the Russian Revolution, the term intelligentsia identified and described the status class of university-educated people whose cultural capital, schooling, education, and intellectual enlightenment allowed them to assume the moral initiative and the practical leadership required in Russian national, regional, and local politics. In practice, the status and social function of the intelligentsia varied by society. In Eastern Europe, the intellectuals were at the periphery of their societies and thus were deprived of political influence and access to the effective levers of political power and of economic development. In Western Europe, the intellectuals were in the mainstream of their societies and thus exercised cultural and political influence that granted access to the power of government office, such as the Bildungsbürgertum, the cultured bourgeoisie of Germany, as well as the professionals of Great Britain. Prepare yourself for an in-depth analysis of background in this section. In a society, the intelligentsia is a status class of intellectuals whose social functions, politics, and national interests are ostensibly distinct from the functions of government, commerce, and the military. In Economy and Society, an outline of interpretive sociology 1921, the political economist Max Weber applied the term intelligentsia in chronological and geographical frames of reference, such as this Christian preoccupation with the formulation of dogmas was, in antiquity, particularly influenced by the distinctive character of intelligentsia, which was the product of Greek education. Thus the intelligentsia originated as a social class of educated people created for the greater benefit of society. In the 19th and 20th centuries, the Polish word and the sociologic concept of the intelligentsia became a European usage to describe the social class of men and women who are the intellectuals of the countries of Central and of Eastern Europe. In Poland, the critical thinkers educated at university. In Russia, the nihilists who opposed traditional values in the name of reason and progress. In the late 20th century, the sociologist Pierre Bourdieu said that the intelligentsia has two types of workers, i.e. intellectual workers who create knowledge, practical and theoretic, and i.e. intellectual workers who create cultural capital. Sociologically, the Polish intelligentsia translates to the intellectuals in France and the Gebildet in Germany. Let's zoom in on European history and understand its implications. The intelligentsia existed as a social stratum in European societies before the term intelligentsia was coined in 19th Poland, to identify the intellectual people whose professions placed them outside the traditional workplaces and labors of the town and country social classes, royalty, aristocracy, bourgeoisie of a monarchy. Thus the intelligentsia are a social class native to the city. In their functions as a status class, the intellectuals realized the cultural development of cities, the dissemination of printed knowledge, literature, textbooks, newspapers, and the economic development of housing for rent, the tenement house for the teacher, the journalist, and the civil servant. In On Love of the Fatherland 1844, the Polish philosopher Karl Liebelt used the term intelligentsia, which was the status class, composed of scholars, teachers, lawyers, and engineers, et al., as the educated people of society who provide the moral leadership required to resolve the problems of society. Hence the social function of the intelligentsia is to guide for the reason of their higher enlightenment. In the arose, The journalist Piotr Bobrikhin popularized the term intelligentsia to identify and describe the Russian social stratum of people educated at university who engage in the intellectual occupations law, medicine, engineering, the arts, who produce the culture and the dominant ideology by which society functions. According to the theory of Dr. Vitaly Tepekhin, the sociological traits usual to the intelligentsia of a society are 1. Advanced for their time moral ideals, moral sensitivity to the neighbor, tact and gentleness in expression. 2. Productive mental work, and in continual self-education. 3. Patriotism based on faith in the people, and inexhaustible, selfless love for the small and the big motherlands. 4. Inherent creativity in every stratum of the intelligentsia, and a tendency to asceticism. 5. An independent personality who speaks freely. 6. A critical attitude towards the government, and public condemnation of injustice. 7. Loyalty to principle by conscience, grace under pressure, and tendency to self-denial. 8. An ambiguous perception of reality, which leads to political fickleness that sometimes becomes conservatism. 9. A sense of resentment, because politics and policies went unrealist, and withdrawal from the public sphere to the in-group. 10. Quarrels about art, ideas, and ideology, which divide the subgroups who compose the intelligentsia. In The Rise of the Intelligentsia, 2008, Mesianowski said that the Polish intelligentsia were the think tank of the state, intellectual servants whose progressive social and economic policies decreased the social backwardness, illiteracy of the Polish people, and also decreased Russian political repression in Partition Poland. Now, let's shift our perspective and explore 19th century through a fresh lens, unlocking new perspectives. In 1844 Poland, the term intelligentsia, identifying the intellectuals of a society, first was used by the philosopher Karl Liebelt, which he described as a status class of people characterized by intellect and Polish nationalism, qualities of mind, character, and spirit that made them natural leaders of the modern Polish nation. That the intelligentsia were aware of their social status and of their duties to society, educating the youth with the nationalist objective to restore the Republic of Poland, preserving the Polish language, and love of the fatherland. Nonetheless, the writers Stanisław Brzozowski and Tadeusz Boylewski criticized Liebelt's ideological and messianic representation of a Polish republic because it originated from the social traditionalism and the reactionary conservatism that pervaded Polish culture and impeded socio-economic progress. Consequent to the Imperial Prussian, Austrian, Swedish and Russian partitions of Poland, the imposition of Tsarist cultural hegemony caused many of the political and cultural elites to participate in the Great Emigration. Let's now turn our attention to Second World War and examine its role within the larger context. After the invasion of Poland on September 1939 by Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, in occupied Poland each side proceeded to eliminate any possible resistance leader. In their part of occupied Poland, the Nazis began the Second World War with the extermination of the Polish intelligentsia by way of the military operations of the Special Prosecution Book Poland, the German IB Action in Poland, the Intelligenzaktion, and the Intelligenzaktion Pommern. In their part of occupied Poland, the Soviet Union proceeded with the extermination of the Polish intelligentsia with operations such as the Katyn Massacre April-May 1940, during which university professors, physicians, lawyers, engineers, teachers, military, policemen, writers and journalists were murdered. In the following segment, we'll be examining imperial era in greater detail. The Russian intelligentsia also was a mixture of messianism and intellectual elitism, which the philosopher Isaiah Berlin described as follows: the phenomenon itself, with its historical and literally revolutionary consequences, is, I suppose, the largest single Russian contribution to social change in the world. The concept of intelligentsia must not be confused with the notion of intellectuals. Its members thought of themselves as united, by something more than mere interest in ideas. They conceived themselves as being a dedicated order, almost a secular priesthood, devoted to the spreading of a specific attitude to life. The idea of progress, which originated in Western Europe during the Age of Enlightenment in the 18th century, became the principal concern of the intelligentsia by the mid-19th century. Thus, progress social movements, such as the Narodniks, mostly consisted of intellectuals. The Russian philosopher Sergei Bulgakov said that the Russian intelligentsia was the creation of Peter, that they were the window to Europe through which the Western air comes to us, vivifying and toxic at the same time. Moreover, Bulgakov also said that the literary critic of Westernization, Vissarion Belinsky, was the spiritual father of the Russian intelligentsia. In 1860, there were 20,000 professionals in Russia and 85,000 by 1900. Originally composed of educated nobles, the intelligentsia became dominated by raznokintsy classless people after 1861. In 1833, 78.9% of secondary school students were children of nobles and bureaucrats. By 1885, there were 49.1% of such students. The proportion of commoners increased from 19 to 43.8%, and the remaining percentage were the children of priests. In fear of an educated proletariat, Tsar Nicholas I limited the number of university students to 3,000 per year, yet there were 25,000 students by 1894. Similarly, the number of periodicals increased from 15 in 1855 to 140 periodical publications in 1885. The third element were professionals hired by Zemstva. By 1900, there were 47,000 of them. Most were liberal radicals. Although Tsar Peter the Great introduced the idea of progress to Russia by the 19th century, the Tsars did not recognize progress as a legitimate aim of the state to the degree that Nicholas I said how repulsive I find that word and wished it removed from the Russian language. Now, let's redirect our focus towards Bolshevik perspective and discover its significance in our narrative. In Russia, the Bolsheviks did not consider the status class of the intelligentsia to be a true social class, as defined in Marxist philosophy. In that time, the Bolsheviks used the Russian word patriotic stratum to identify and define the intelligentsia as a separating layer without an inherent class character. In the creation of post-monarchic Russia, Lenin was firmly critical of the class character of the intelligentsia, commending the growth of the intellectual forces of the workers and the peasants will depose the bourgeoisie and their accomplices, intelligence, lackeys of capital who think that they are brain of the nation. In fact, it is not brain, but dung. The Russian Revolution of 1917 divided the intelligentsia and the social classes of Tsarist Russia. Some Russians emigrated, the political reactionaries joined the right-wing white movement for counter-revolution, some became Bolsheviks, and some remained in Russia and participated in the political system of the USSR. In reorganizing Russian society, the Bolsheviks deemed non-Bolshevik intelligentsia class enemies and expelled them from society, by way of deportation on philosophers' ships, forced labor in the Gulag, and summary execution. The members of the Tsarist-era intelligentsia who remained in Bolshevik Russia, the USSR, were proletarianized. Although the Bolsheviks recognized the managerial importance of the intelligentsia to the future of Soviet Russia, the bourgeois origin of this stratum gave reason for distrust of their ideological commitment to Marxist philosophy and Bolshevik societal control. In this chapter, we'll be shedding light on Soviet Union and its role in shaping our understanding. In the late Soviet Union, the term intelligentsia acquired a formal definition of mental and cultural workers. There were subcategories of scientific technical intelligentsia and creative intelligentsia. Between 1917 and 1941, there was a massive increase in the number of engineering graduates, from 15,000 to over 250,000. In this segment, we'll be unraveling the complexities of post-Soviet period and exploring its multifaceted nature. In the post-Soviet period, The members of the former Soviet intelligentsia have displayed diverging attitudes towards the communist government. While the older generation of intelligentsia has attempted to frame themselves as victims, the younger generation, who were in theirs when the Soviet Union collapsed, has not allocated so much space for the repressive experience in their self-narratives. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the popularity and influence of the intelligentsia has significantly declined. Therefore, it is typical for the post-Soviet intelligentsia to feel nostalgic for the last years of the Soviet Union perestroika, which they often regard as the golden age of the intelligentsia. Vladimir Putin has expressed his view on the social duty of intelligentsia in modern Russia. We should all be aware of the fact that when revolutionary and evolutionary changes come, things can get even worse. The intelligentsia should be aware of this. And it is the intelligentsia specifically that should keep this in mind and prevent society from radical steps and revolutions of all kinds. We've had enough of it. We've seen so many revolutions and wars. We need decades of calm and harmonious development. As we venture forward, let's examine mass intelligentsia in detail and gain a deeper appreciation for its significance. In the 20th century, from the status class term intelligentsia, sociologists derived the term mass intelligentsia to describe the populations of educated adults with discretionary income who pursue intellectual interests by way of book clubs and cultural associations, and so on. That sociological term was made popular usage by the writer Melvin Bragg, who said that mass intelligentsia conceptually explains the popularity of book clubs and literary festivals that otherwise would have been of limited intellectual interests to most people from the middle class and from the working class. In the book Campus Power Struggle 1970, the sociologist Richard Flax addressed the concept of mass intelligentsia. I appreciate your time and I'm grateful for every like, comment, and share.